Welcome, everyone. I'm Aurelien Portuese, the Director of Antitrust and Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, the world's top think tank for science and technology. So this is Dynamic Antitrust, a conversation series organized in partnership with Competition Policy International. And in this conversation series, we discuss a number of issues and the relationship between competition and innovation, and how antitrust can better integrate innovation objectives. So in this series, we have a number of events with some panel and experts, and we regularly have those panel for the discussion. But also we have some discussion with book authors who can discuss their ideas on the state of competition in America. Today, I'm delighted to have Professor Jonathan Baker, whose latest book, The Antitrust Paradigm, Restoring a Competitive Economy, was published in 2019 at Harvard University Press. So, Jonathan, thank you for being with us. It's a great pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
So Jonathan is Research Professor of Law at American University Washington College of Law. Jonathan served as the Chief Economist of the Federal Communications Commission from 2009 and 2011, and as a Director of the Bureau of Economic at the Federal Trade Commission from 1995 to 1998. He has an extensive experience at the President's Council of Economic Advisor, at the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, and more generally in academia. So it's a great pleasure to discuss this book, which is a very important book. So let's talk about your book. So the Antitrust Paradigm, your book is a phenomenal tour de force where you explain in great detail and yet accessible language how antitrust has been under-enforced over the last few years and more generally over the last few decades. So let me tell you how I see your book. I think it's a magistral antithesis of Robert's book, Antitrust Paradox, published in 1978. For our viewers, Robert Box in 1978, together with Richard Posner's book that you mentioned in your book, these two books had a very influential impact on antitrust, and they have shaped how antitrust has been enforced through the Chicago School emphasis on efficiency and more particularly the consumer welfare standard. So Robert Box stated in his book by considering that there was a crisis in antitrust. Antitrust sometimes preserved competition and sometimes suppressed competition. And this resulted in a policy at war with itself. That's what he argued. He similarly wrote that consideration of the virtues appropriate to law as law demonstrate that the only legitimate goal of antitrust is the maximization of consumer welfare. You, in replying decades later of antitrust enforcement, you reply that today's antitrust paradox is not Box's paradox. It is a surprising conjunction of substantial market power with well-established and extensive enforcement doctrines and extensive antitrust institutions. Antitrust doctrines and enforcement actions, once thought adequate to protect competition, are proving insufficient. Fixing the problem is urgent. That's what you write as a start of your book. So why is fixing the problem urgent for you of these great problems?
So there are lots of reasons. One is that that since Bork and Posner wrote, market power has been growing. It's been growing for decades. We have, and there's a lot of evidence of that, by the way. There's rising markups. There's less dynamism in the economy. Slowed rates that productive firms expand and innovate, or secular slowdown in business investment, and the rate of startups is falling. The profit share of gross domestic products rising. A bunch of reasons like that, and there's also and we have studies showing all of these things, and studies showing, for example, the growth of equity ownership by rival firms that in the hands of financial investors, common ownership. So all these things have potential to soften competition, or have done so, or could be the result of growing market power. And market power is surely part of the explanation. I mean, we have, it's not what we're seeing in the economy over decades is not entirely the product of growing scale economies or the rents to the first movers in information technology. It's lax antitrust is a plausible cause. The timing is similar. The influence of the Chicago school thinkers that you mentioned on the courts was really led to a great transformation of antitrust rules starting in the late 70s through the 1980s. And so that's roughly after that when market power started growing. And there's reasons to think we insufficiently deter coordination, that we insufficiently deter anti-competitive mergers, that we insufficiently deter anti-competitive exclusion. So the bottom line is we've had, like, since the 1980s or so, we've had less antitrust and growing market power. And it's to the point where it's a threat to it leads to growing inequality, reduced innovation, less dynamism, all sorts of problems that we need to address.
Chicago's schools proved very influential, and there was a political consensus also to go to that without Chicago School. And this is demonstrated, as you write, in the 2007 Bipartisan Antitrust Modernization Commission, where both Republicans and Democrats gave a stand-up approval of the current antitrust enforcement. So this political bipartisan consensus is the antitrust paradigm you described. And what is this antitrust paradigm specifically, and what does it entail? I mean, this lax enforcement, as you explained. What is this paradigm, and how can we explain that this paradigm has taken place? How could it be influential?
Well, I think you're asking what is about the way in which our political system adopted antitrust as the approach to dealing with large firms, and the history is pretty interesting. For half a century after the Sherman Act, we had no consensus in the United States about how to deal with large firms, and they were a new phenomenon. Large industrial firms and that changing everyone's life, moving people from the farms to the cities, and new products were being created, and the Sears catalog could reach everybody with the railroad. And large firms were huge in American life, and there were, roughly speaking, three positions on how to deal with them. One was they're great, bringing us new and wonderful things, and we should just accept them. And one was that we ought to deconcentrate, essentially, or in some fashion regulate. And there was also an industrial policy kind of approach, accepting large firms, letting them achieve scale economies, too. But then there's also, let's create more competition. So the policy went back and forth in lots of ways, like through the New Deal, before that, and then the how to deal with large firms was a center of the political discussion. The election in 1912 was right in the wake of the Standard Oil decision, was fought in a large part over how to deal with large firms in the economy, and led to new legislation, etc. But that didn't fix that election didn't solve the question politically. When it got solved, essentially in the 1940s, when all the branches of government accepted the competition, we would try to allow our firms to continue, but ensure that they were competitive to the extent we could, and have competitive markets. And that was essentially a political consensus, and you know that because both first three branches of government got to the same place. We had the Thurman Arnold, Robert Jackson first, and then Thurman Arnold brought all cases and ramped up enforcement against large firms, and the new cases were led to precedents that were seminal precedents. Saccone Vacuum on coordination, the Alcoa case on exclusion, and then Congress endorsed this approach in the 1950 merger legislation too. And after that, what happened was the political saliency of competition antitrust eroded. It disappeared. The Richard Hofstadter famously asked, like about in the 50s, I think it was, whatever happened to the antitrust movement? So that's when we developed. So essentially, in the 1940s or so, we adopted we reached a political consensus that we would have large firms be dealt with by competition, and the advantage of that is that it lets firms achieve benefits, innovate and achieve efficiencies, and encourages economic growth. And then potentially, the idea was that we would share the benefits throughout the economy. And the problem is that with the reforms, the way in which antitrust laws were reformed in the 1980s on in the Chicago School approach, we're no longer having those benefits shared widely, and we're no longer having as competitive. We're having growing market power, so we're in danger of losing everything that was created in the 1940s to the benefit of our economy and living in our society.
Right. So that's very interesting to see. That's a history of inherent tensions within the antitrust movement, right, between the constitutionalist or the more like Chicago School. And so you predicted in your book, because you discuss about the history, but also the potential future of antitrust, and you predicted precisely that you write that the more we stick to the Chicago School, the further the pendulum will swing in response, and a successful leftist political mobilization untethered from centrists cannot be expected to restore antitrust. Anti-corporate populists, you write, will seek extensive governmental supervision, and that is very end quote. And that is very interesting, because you obviously advocate for reinvigorating antitrust enforcement and to have a stronger antitrust enforcement. And one of your arguments you use is precisely that if we do nothing, then there will be more radical answers, more radical regulation, or more different types of regulation, which it may not be antitrust. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that? Like, what would be the consequence if we do not reinvigorate antitrust in terms of the different regulations and more radical answers that we can anticipate?
Well, so the danger is if we allow market power to keep growing, and that we have we're losing the idea that everyone in society is benefiting from economic growth that competition creates, and the rents from market power are really going largely to the people who are already well off, increasing inequality. We're not seeing prosperity being shared. We haven't seen that for decades. It's really on the whole, the increased prosperity in the economy is going only to is going to the wealthy, and all this you can see that if we don't restore the kind of market stronger competition policy, don't really strengthen it, then we could lose it altogether. People will, not surprisingly, would give up on antitrust, and one could, there's a plausible constituency for dealing with large firms in a regulatory way. Now you have to get there politically. It's right now there's also a very strong political view that among some conservatives that everything's just fine as it is, and that's the policy that probably that would it may well be what the Supreme Court thinks. Given which we know about the justices and how they've decided antitrust cases, and that's the kind of policy that would let the market power grow even further. And so you could get the debate being between leave everything as it is to benefit business, and people who want to say that that's outrageous exploitation. We need to, antitrust doesn't work, we need to regulate. And that's the kind of choice I would like to avoid.
And you suggest the middle way of reinvigorating antitrust.
Yes, essentially by strengthening it and strengthening the rules. Yes.
Yeah. So also we'll come to that with the economic analysis and also the enforcement actions that we can have. So I would like to delve more into the chapter 8. On the chapter 8, you discuss and you identify the threats to innovation, right? The threats to innovation from lessened competition. One of these threats that you identify is the innovation harm from mergers. And this is a very timely debate, you can see in the news. And there's this idea that mergers can lessen innovation competition, either by allowing the merged firm to internalize future product market competition, what you call the unilateral effect theory, or by deterring new product development by rivals. That's what you call the exclusionary theory. I want to focus only on the unilateral effect theory, and particularly on the so-called acquisition of potential competitors by a dominant company. These mergers, since you wrote this book, now have been referred more in the press, like in the academia, as killer acquisitions, right? And before addressing the question of killer acquisitions, what do you think about market concentration? What's the level of market concentration? Is the level of market concentration worrying you those days, or and do you think that markets have concentrated too much since the last few years?
Okay, so you set it all up to ask me about one question, and then you flipped it at the end. All right, so let's talk about concentration. The statistics on concentration overall aren't very meaningful, helpful, or reliable, in the economy. We don't really have a good handle on what's happening overall. But I can say that there are a number of industries, lots of industries where there's competition growing, and competition is growing. Or has grown over time. And in many of those industries, we have studies that are independent of concentration that, using the modern econometric toolkit, that show that market power has grown. So the problem is the market power, not concentration per se. Concentration is an indicator, potentially, that we have a problem. But for example, in airlines, we've had a great increase in concentration, in at least I don't know, at least nationwide, whether on individual routes, I don't know, don't recall as well, but there are also studies that show that there's increased coordination in airlines. So we have the same kind of problem in brewing, in beer. We're now we have two large firms own a lot of the brands that we drink and a lot of the beer that we drink, and we have good economic studies showing that there's greater coordination as a result of the mergers that created that. Same thing with hospitals. There's lots of good literature. So there are a number of industries where where I wouldn't just say concentration's rising, but I can say independently that there's reason to think that the consolidation or the has led to growing market power, and it makes me worry. And there are other industries too where its concentration is on the rise too. So all in all, there are many industries that we need to be concerned about, and this is could well be that lax merger enforcement is one of the reasons for growing market power.
Yeah. So
but do you want to go back to the other question, or
exactly? But it was important to have a focus on market power and not merely on market concentration. Market concentration can be a measurement of the increase of market power, but it's not the end of the analysis in itself. The goal is to measure market power, I think. And precisely, I want to go back to my questions on killer acquisitions, because it's a very timely question. So you refer in your book of what this social media platform case, which is a famous case, and we can see that more generally, would you take into consideration for the issue of killer acquisitions the fact that there's also a willingness for the startup sometimes to be bought off as an enabler acquisition, so that small companies, small rivals may be willing to scale up by being bought off? Or would you merely focus on the anti-competitive and effect of this potential acquisition?
Right. So, just in a general way, one thinks that you'd want to think about not just you want to think about anti-competitive harms and pro-competitive benefits. In evaluating cases and setting policy, or creating presumptions, or developing antitrust rules. So, in a general way, you don't necessarily want to ignore pro-competitive benefits as well. But the overall problem today is that on average the rules are too weak and we're not enforcing enough. So whatever we do, we want to increase strengthen antitrust laws, which will involve being tougher. But with respect to the what you call the killer acquisition, I think you're not quite using the term precisely. So there's a difference between a dominant firm acquiring either a potential rival or a nascent competitor, let's say in a high-tech market, which okay, and there's a difference between that and and the more narrow phenomenon of acquiring a firm that has a R&D stream that would end up with a product that would compete with you, and then shutting down the R&D stream. It's the latter that's the killer acquisition per se. But I really think you're interested in the broader question of, and there is a literature showing that in pharmaceuticals, this is actually it's not just a theoretical problem.
Because problem can be also about the discontinuation of the product, right? The firms merged, and so the product which were in competition are discontinued by the merged firm, right?
Yes. You also might expect that it wouldn't literally be, there'd be plenty of cases where the merged firm wouldn't discontinue the product or completely shut down the R&D stream, but they would channel the R&D stream in a different direction, make it more complementary, or less of a direct, competition, or not, or take remove from the market the acquired product, but change its features, and so it's less and not have it compete as aggressively on price, let's say. The question of acquisitions of potential and nascent rivals is really broader than just per se killer acquisitions. But it is an important problem. Because when you have a dominant firm, it's dominant. Its dominance could be protected by things like network effects and scale economies and high customer switching costs. And it may turn out that in a lot of cases, the most important competition for the dominant firm is from potential rivals or nascent competitors. Not necessarily just the fringe rivals that might still be there. And those, by the way, could be vertical merger. They could be horizontal mergers, vertical or conglomerate. They could be any kind. It's not. And we need to worry.
You want
regardless.
to make a distinction between vertical or horizontal or conglomerate mergers.
Not with respect to the acquisition of potential or nascent competitors. Regardless of whether it's vertical, horizontal, or conglomerate, if it's a competitive, if it's an important potential competitive threat to the dominant firm, or at least even plausibly has the capabilities to be a competitive threat, that may be all we've got. And we need to protect that potential competition. And so the recent increase in enforcement tension to this, I'm thinking like the Visa Plaid merger, for example, at the Justice Department challenge. That's all good, but it's just starting to be a growing area of attention, and we need to do more. And I think really courts ought to presume that there's competitive harm when a dominant firm acquires a potential rival. Could be a rebuttable presumption. You could make your argument about buyout and that sort of thing, but we ought to presume competitive harm. And and by the way, with respect to buyout, there's actually a literature that the literature goes both ways on that. That is to say, if firms are getting created in anticipation of buyout, they innovate in a different way potentially than if they're trying to compete directly with or aggressively with the dominant firm. And it's not obvious that the argument you made is not the entire story.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a problem of the level of R&D pre-merger and after merger, and there's also this problem of discontinuation. So I would like to just go back to, I think you hinted to that on the very first beginning of our discussion. I mean, in your book, I can show it now. It's the subtitle is Restoring a Competitive Economy. So of course, it refers to the fact that the competitive economy used to be competitive. The economy used to be competitive. So just a very broad question, and it's when was the idea of the economy was most competitive and the antitrust laws were optimally enforced? Like, what's the ideal benchmark?
What I probably should have said was something like restoring a more competitive economy. I don't think there's some golden age that I can point to in the past where everything was wonderful. But what I can say, and as we did talk about in detail before, we have market power has been growing for decades. It's substantial now. So we need to strengthen the antitrust laws, and doing that will make the economy more competitive, and that's a good thing.
So it's more an agenda, and that's your last chapter, of course. It's a more an agenda for the future, and that's a very interesting point. On the more practical aspect, you refer to this technocratic or like the need for economic analysis in antitrust, which we can refer to as technocratic, but also there's a need for antitrust laws to reflect the popular will and for Congress to act. Do you see a tension, or how can we reconcile the need, because you advocate for antitrust law to be reinvigorated, still with economic analysis? So it means experts, these very complex arguments, perhaps in court or somewhere, and on the other side, the need for taking into consideration the popular will and perhaps the legitimate interest of the Congress to act. do you see this tension between, let's say, technocratic antitrust and more popular view of antitrust?
Not necessarily. No. I mean, economics and economic analysis, and economic evidence in cases, and that's important. It's not the whole story, by the way, in practice, because we have generalist judges deciding cases. We don't have technical experts deciding cases. The generalist judges have to evaluate the economic evidence just the same way they evaluate scientific evidence, technical evidence in torts cases or intellectual property cases and that sort of thing. And you don't have to be an economic expert or an antitrust expert to see that the antitrust rules aren't working right now. That market power is growing, that the growth isn't being shared widely, and inequality is being enhanced. So we need popular support for antitrust to get stronger laws to stop market power, and the reverse. We need to strengthen antitrust to preserve popular support for it, so we don't get what we talked about before. And that could be done in the courts, which can formulate rules that incorporate more presumptions. It can be done legislatively, and there are legislative proposals for all that. But the resolution of individual cases will still turn on the application of economic analysis, and the rules that are developed should reflect, ideally would reflect the best economic thinking. So it's not. So the economics is still essential, and popular support is also essential for antitrust to be successful.
Yeah, and that's a very good point of saying that we need economic analysis and also the popular and the political support that's fundamental for antitrust to be legitimate and acceptable. But at the same time, there's all these arguments saying that the court, the judicial process in court takes too long, and some say that we should just perhaps take antitrust away from the court, or have a more political enforcement, more by regulation rather than by judicial process. I just refer, for example, to the European discussion currently on the Digital Market Act, where you say that antitrust in the court is perhaps taking too long, and we see it with some cases where obviously it will take years before a final decision is taken, and the people may be just not happy with these very long timeline. Do you think it's a legitimate concern that judicial process takes too long?
Well, there's yes and no. So antitrust law operates mainly through deterrence. That is, people, the courts establish, or the Congress establishes rules. Really, in practice in the U.S., it's the courts implementing broad statutes, develop rules, and firms are counseled by their antitrust lawyers how not to stay away from the line and not cross it. And the result is that most of the work that the antitrust laws do to make sure that we have competition in the economy is not done through enforcement. It's done through deterrence. Now, enforcement can take a long time, and if you were worrying about the particular victims of a particular anti-competitive conduct, you're right. It can take a long time to address at times, and it can also be hard to restore competition in some industries once it's lost. And so to that extent, I agree with you, but that doesn't, that focusing overly on that loses sight of the importance of deterrence. And the other thing I'd want to say about antitrust is it's not necessarily in opposition to antitrust. It's not like, we talked about it as, we talked about essentially implicitly talking about price regulation as an alternative to antitrust and fostering competition as a way to protect against the bad things that the market power of dominant firms.
Monopoly pricing.
But regulation can also supplement antitrust and promote competition. So there are various kinds of things that are talked about in the context of dominant platforms that could potentially, ought to be thought about potentially as doing that, like platform interoperability or data portability or open standards. Whether they are helpful in individual cases, you need to think about. But the general spirit of using regulation to supplement antitrust and create competition is a good thing. When that's what the FCC did with number portability, and cell phones, for example.
Yeah, that's and so that's the point I want to develop, because you also say that there can be a supplement between patent law and antitrust, and so you argue precisely that antitrust can supplement contract and patent law to protect innovation incentive, as well as to prevent patent holders, as you just said, from setting supra-competitive prices. So can you elaborate a bit on the complementarity between antitrust and patent law, and because sometimes it may lead to mandatory licensing or these requirements. There's a need for, and I think the tension is increasingly with the innovation and the digital economy that we see the tensions or supplements between antitrust and patent law. Can we?
I guess I want to say a couple things. One is that you may be referring to the standard setting context, where there's a big debate about hold up and hold out and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But let's put that aside. And just in general, let me start out by saying what the big picture idea is that competition, not monopoly, is the better spur to innovation. And there are times when it may be that temporary monopoly is appropriate for encouraging innovation, and then you you can have firms with different technologies that happen to be patented could compete. That's certainly an outcome that happens sometimes in like pharmaceuticals, say, or that sort of thing. But it's also the reverse is also possible. So that in that setting, competition and patents, would both be promoting innovation. But there are other settings where that's not the case, we actually had a long. Sorry.
The patent holder can act opportunistically. That's
in the standard setting context. That's the concern. But there's a broader concern too about whether we have, about whether patents are just too broad, overall. During the 40s and 50s, there were a lot of 60s. There were a lot of antitrust cases against dominant firms that were resolved with requiring compulsory licensing of intellectual property, and in many cases that was hugely beneficial for society. So that's what happened with plain paper copying with Xerox when the Federal Trade Commission.
And the most recent case is Oracle and Google that we just had a few weeks ago.
Well, I don't know. But what I know is about these older cases is that you can say demonstrably that it was good for innovation to there and the Bell Labs. The Bell, the patent, the 1956 AT&T patent, compulsory licensing agreements too. There's a economics literature on both of those that show that they were hugely beneficial for innovation. So I wouldn't assume that more patents is always good. It's for competition or for innovation.
Yeah, that's right. Very interesting, because that's the very old debate and discussion between the relationship between competition and innovation. It's not a very easy relationship. I just want to close before we go for Q&A and question and answers. You refer to the book in the book of to Richard Gilbert's book, and also he has this notion of moving from price-centric to innovation-centric antitrust enforcement, and you also emphasize throughout the book the need for innovation and the need for innovation as an objective to antitrust. What would you say? What would you recommend to antitrust enforcers and to courts for having, to have a more dynamic approach to competition, where innovation can be perhaps at the center of antitrust concern and center of enforcement?
So you're right. A more dynamic approach, I think, would account for both how firm conduct and antitrust enforcement would affect innovation and economic growth. And the starting point for thinking about that, I think, is that competition, even in current products, encourages productivity and innovation, and that's well established in the economics literature that greater competition leads to greater productivity, both in industries and firms. And there's an old business consulting literature from very senior folks in that field that connects greater domestic competition with international competitiveness. And there are even empirical studies connecting competition and innovation, as well. And as I said in the beginning, that growing market power is a leading candidate for explaining the slow dynamism in our economy. So just more antitrust enforcement overall is going to be good for innovation, encouraging competition in current products, but will on average enhance innovation incentives. Encouraging competition in innovation competition or competition in future products is also more directly going to foster innovation. So I think we ought to, encourage enforcers and courts to, pay attention to this, and that'll mean doing things like presuming that there's competitive harm when we talked about before, when a dominant firm acquires a nascent rival, or if there's only a handful of firms in an innovation market and two of them merge or one of those excluded. So that's how I think more strengthening antitrust enforcement is
more dynamic.
More dynamic, not just a static focus.
More dynamic perspective to antitrust. Yes. And this will entail, just very quickly before we move, this will entail perhaps a rethink of the way we define markets. But that's because if we want to
I don't know that. I think you're wrong about that. Because I think you have in mind an idea that if technology is changing rapidly, then entry is easy, and you'd get all sorts of competition would show up, and the exercise of market power is unlikely. And I would want to resist that, because there are lots of markets where there's network effects or scale economies, and that lead to a dominant firm, and customer switching costs are high, and you don't get necessarily easy entry. So I wouldn't want to use the idea of dynamic competition as an excuse to give dominant firms in high-tech markets a free pass under the antitrust laws.
That's right. But I was also referring in my head to the geographic market definition, like a global competition, like also having more like potential entry, foreign entry into the market, or like this view of how market grow also at the global stage. And that leads us to precisely our first question, which is very related to that Q&A question. Should current antitrust US policy take into account geopolitical tensions and industrial policy consideration when it comes to structural remedies, but also I think more broadly for antitrust? So this idea of, you refer to it, of industrial policy, but also of geopolitical dimension, global competition.
Well, if we thought that competition from foreign firms is really important. I guess what you're saying is perhaps global markets could sometimes become domestic markets because of geopolitical tensions or something like that. That we would have either the foreign trade barriers would get erected for reasons having nothing to do with competition policy. If that happens, then of course you should take that into account in analyzing whether practices harm competition or benefit them. It might, and you're right, it could potentially change market, either market definition or at least the competitive significance of foreign firms that are still importing. So yes, in that sense, I agree.
All right. Second question: do you think that in order to successfully reform antitrust laws, do we need a new framework replacing the consumer welfare standard? I think we touched upon that question, but yeah.
Yes, we more or less I agree, touched upon that. And I think we can strengthen the antitrust laws by using the best economic thinking to figure out ways to where the problems are and where the courts are going wrong and how to improve it. But it doesn't necessarily require
completely revolution.
Taking into a complete revolution. Yes, that's right. Or taking into account
of course, this refers to the idea of public interest standard or like more open-textured standard. So
But I will say that the people who want to change the antitrust laws, are doing important and helpful work in focusing attention on the competitive problems in the economy and the need to do strengthening. Whether the issue here we're talking about this question is precisely how.
Yeah, exactly.
Not the big picture need to do that.
A third and final question: do you think it's worth to study the Standard Oil monopoly in order to attest if strangled innovation in their time, for example, in electric engine cars?
So I think I don't know about the whether or not that happened. Whether the technology for I had the impression that electric cars are only appropriate, potentially important today as a technology because we have developments in battery technology and that sort of thing that probably require materials technology that wasn't available then. But the general idea of studying older cases and learning from them is important and worthwhile, and that's what I was alluding to, for example, when I talked about what we learned from the compulsory licensing in plain paper copiers.
Yeah. A final question: is it possible for the alternative fractions of both parties to come together to pass new antitrust regulation? I think that's kind of what we see those days, where we can have bipartisan support. So what do you think about these bipartisan new consensus, or when you see?
Well, I think there was more consensus 5 years ago.
Yeah,
that we now have. I think what you're alluding to is the fact that there's not just a split now on the left and the Democrats, let's say, between the people who want to transform antitrust and more center left. Let's have a heightened concern and strengthen it, like Senator Klobuchar. But on among the Republicans, we still have plenty of pro-business conservatives who think antitrust is okay as it is, and I don't see them, at the moment, having been convinced. There's another group on the populist right that wants to do something, and they're concerned with, particularly with threats to conservative speech from dominant information technology platforms.
That's right.
Whether they want to do something, but whether it's not clear that where the bipartisan support would be and what would get bipartisan support now. So it would be nice if the various factions in the parties would get together to strengthen antitrust. And I hope that something useful will be done in Congress, but I don't know whether that'll happen.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what you discuss in your book, and also what you speculate for the future and see how we can build up this new consensus. And you identify also factors for building up this momentum in order to get this consensus right. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for this great discussion. I recommend everybody to just read this book because it's very thought-provoking, very detailed, and it's a leading book on what's going on today and describes the critique of the Chicago School, and it's very inspiring and very useful. So thank you very much for being with us this morning, and it was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for inviting me. I enjoyed talking with you, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you.